Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Thought Leader Series, sponsored by the Masters of Science in Positive Organization Development and Change, also known as MPOD, at the Case Weatherhead School of Management. This month's Thought Leader Series features Richard Boyatzis, a distinguished university professor, the H. Clark Ford Professor, and Professor of Organization Behavior, Psychology, and Cognitive Science here at Case Western Reserve University. At this time, I'm going to give the session over to Richard to give us the updated and renewed version of rampant narcissism, loss of motivation and engagement, and deteriorating mental health.
Thanks, Pat. When Pat and I were talking about what titles, I actually threw that out as a joke, but she said, "Oh, that's a good one. Let's take it seriously." So I actually am going to address these things. And for those of you who I've had in class in recent years, you'll recognize some of the stuff. It's a bit different than those of you who I've had in classes 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. But welcome. What I want to talk about is really to focus on the neuroscience of effective coaching. And why am I talking about that? Well, I think coaching is not just a practice, but it's a metaphor for any helping relationship. So as a manager, as a physician, as a nurse, as a therapist, as a formal coach, as a trainer, as a parent, we are engaged in trying to help people be open and learn and change all the time. So the activities I'm going to talk about, a lot of which we reported in our 2019 book, Helping People Change. By we, I mean Professors Melvin Smith and Ellen Van Osten and myself. But it also represents research of a whole bunch of different of us working on it. So what I'm going to do is talk about the dilemmas confronting us around any of helping relationships, try to talk about the psychophysiological effects that it has on us, and then go into how do we get around it, and how has the research that we've been doing in the last 30 years on hormonal systems and our fMRI imaging studies helped guide us. And then hopefully I'll be able to do all that and have enough time to open it up again for a whole bunch of questions. So let me go to my screen share and see if I can get, okay. So Pat will make a copy of the slides available, so don't freak out and don't feel like you have to keep taking pictures of them. But so you'll get them, I think, if you want, right, Pat?
Yes, I will make them available and email them to everybody with the recording link of today's session.
Good.
As soon as it's available.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
Let me start with an observation that change is stressful, though no matter whether the change is something that we really want to do or is something we're being forced to do. The thing is that change is in and of itself a stressful event. And let's face it, I mean, the doses that we get these days are really at the chronic stress level. Because even pre-COVID, most of us in professions and in management roles and in helping roles were already there. And at this level of stress, we are cognitively, perceptually, and emotionally impaired. Now, we also know that when you try to help another person in whatever form, that it's stressful because of the responsibility. It's what Dave McClellan had called power stress, and the fact that it demands more self-control on your part. So a part of today's meta message is there's no way we're going to be able to help our colleagues or patients, subordinates, or family be open to learning and change unless we are open to learning and change. So it starts with how we're handling it. So let me go into an exercise right now that we'll do. And for this exercise, just get out a piece of paper and pencil. And what I want you to do is ask yourself, who helped me the most become who I am, or get to where I am. Who helped me the most become who I am or get to, and just write down names of a few people that come to mind. As you think of these various folks, what I'd like you to do is go back to the first name you put down and think of a moment you had with them in which you learned something important. And right next to their name, just jot down a few notes that will help you remember that moment, what they said or did. And I'm going to go silent for about a minute and let you write some notes for the first, second, maybe even the third person on your list. Thank you, and I apologize for interrupting your reflections. What I'd like to do to help us, because I'm trying to use, it'd be impossible to talk about emotions and all of these issues without doing an exercise, so that's why we're doing it. But what I want you to do right now is think about how you feel right now. How do you feel remembering these individuals and these moments you had with them? And if you could go to the chat feature and just type in a word or two or a phrase describing how you feel remembering them. Thankful, grateful, energized, inspired, more grateful, blessed, seen, feel content, calm, grateful and valued, encouraged, appreciated, liked and loved, calm, understood, valued, fortunate, humbled, more grateful, loved and happy, opened up, thankful and inspired, thankful and seen, cared about, smarter. Oh, that's a cute one. Profoundly grateful and lucky, more confident, grateful, secure, strong. I've done this exercise on all 7 continents, yes, including Antarctica. I've done it in about 65 countries. And your emotional responses are what people usually say. It doesn't matter whether we're in Astana, Kazakhstan, or Milano, or Cleveland. People feel moved that somebody cared for them that much, somebody loved them. They very often feel, as many of you said, grateful, thankful, appreciative, moved, proud that somebody loved them. People end up feeling humbled by it often. And as some of you said, people felt inspired or energized. Some people felt calm, as a number of you said. Some people, I didn't see anybody here say it, but some people will say they felt nostalgic, which are very often is code for they felt sad because the person they were thinking of has passed away. If you had any of those feelings, not all of them, any of them, you just spent about 6 minutes in the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, I'm going to call that part of the nervous system, it's arousal in your body, renewal, for reasons that I'll explain in a moment. But what it ends up being is a very important distinction that I'll make. And this feeling that you had, I want you to remember it, because we often know what it feels like to be stressed, but we're not very good at somatic awareness of what it feels like to be in renewal. So stick with that sensation, because that's going to be an important part of helping you and you helping others deal with and find new meaning, change, and learning. Before we analyze it, I just want to ask you to further reflect, maybe this afternoon, maybe this evening over a glass of wine or a cup of tea. I don't want to encourage any alcohol abuse, but reflect on whose list will you be on? Whose list will you be on? There's only two ways to have a legacy in life, folks. One is to donate money to a university and a program like the MPOD. Now, I'm actually paid to say that, but facetiously. Really, the only legacy we have in life are our relationships and the people that we've touched. I mean, not in the HR sense, but in the emotional sense of people that we've built a caring relationship with. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to talk about kind of what that meant, what this feeling and these moments meant. Because many people probably put down their mother or father or a grandparent or maybe an aunt or an uncle. Sometimes it's a coach from school or a teacher, sometimes an early manager, sometimes later in life, a spouse or partner. But the moment that you remembered typically is a moment where they asked you about possibilities. They didn't say, oh, Vanya, you're a girl, you should be a nurse. It was, have you ever considered? Or what do you think of? And it feels like the interaction with them is helping you open up. And that moment is a very powerful moment. And I'm going to go back to my screen sharing to help with this. Because what we're doing is activating what I will describe in a moment as the positive emotional attractor. Now, many of you know this, but since 1967, when I left working on interplanetary vehicles in the aerospace field, I've been devoted to psychology, and I started working on this, the early version of this theory, back in spring of 67 with Dave Kolb. And over the years, it's morphed and it's changed. I now call it intentional change theory. But basically, what I discovered in the process of asking the question, I mean, see, what basically happened was my parents are immigrants from Greece. My father, by the time he came over to the States, took out papers, Pearl Harbor was attacked. The next thing you know, he was in the US Army, even though he couldn't speak English very well. But he got a chance to work and secure the jungles in Panama and then land on Normandy and go through France and Germany for the United States. So he gets out, and even though he'd started university, he didn't have the wherewithal. He had met my mother and gotten married. So during the early years, 4 times in elementary school, actually different years, my teachers at PS 150 in Queens tried to lead me back because they thought I was cognitively slow. And it really wasn't until after Sputnik went up when they tested everybody, and the teacher called me in, and I called my parents in, which meant my mother, because my father worked 7 days a week from 3 in the afternoon to 3 in the morning. But my mother had said, when she got the notes, her eyes rolled. She said, oh, this again. But my 6th grade teacher said to her, we tested everybody. She said, yes. She said, your son's really smart. She said, oh, I know that. I'm glad somebody finally noticed. So they offered her for me the chance to either skip 2 grades or be in this advanced program, which we now call an AP program, where we would do junior high school, and 2 years of college. She was fortunately aware enough of the fact that I was a bit geeky and not as socially advanced as I should be, so she took that option. And it turns out that I was really good in math and physics, and I just loved the idea of going into space, and I always wanted to do it. And I was ecstatic when I got into my first choice school, MIT, and I was studying all that, but I ran out of money. I'd used up all my scholarships, every loan that I could get. I'd used up all the money I'd made, playing music with my bands. And so MIT got me in the Aero and Astro department, got me a job doing the space work for Northrop Norrell. So I went out there for about 6 months, and we were getting paid regular rates so we could save enough money to finish. But in the process, I learned that the actual day-to-day work was boring. So we come back to MIT, and my two fraternity brothers that were out there with me, they both wanted to stay in engineering, and Northrop had offered us jobs as soon as we graduated, but I didn't. And I didn't want to go back into the restaurant business like my father and every Greek relative I had in New York. I didn't think I was quite good enough to really make it with my music. And I said, I know what I'll do. I'll go into management. It's got to be easy. Look at these idiots we had at Northrop. The Sloan School, the management school at MIT, had this thing where professors got up and described their courses if they didn't have prerequisites. So I went to this session, and this young fellow who was finishing his PhD at Harvard in psychology, David Kolb, was describing his course. And it was a course called Organizational Psychology. I've got to say, it sounded like utter crap to me. I couldn't believe people would actually study something like this. But in his description of the course, he said 2 words that made me run to the basement room, to his classroom, and get in, which I was able to because everything was oversubscribed. The 2 words were no tests. I found out years later in studying clinical psychology that I'm test phobic. But anyway, another story. I like to tell the story because the path of our lives very often changes on things that are seemingly irrelevant or insignificant. It was this when I said to Dave, I wanted to do a paper on how managers don't help their subordinates. He said, well, why don't we flip it around, and why don't you use some data we've just collected on how their version of the MBA program, these 28 to 30-year-olds, were helping each other or not in their classes over 2 semesters. We published a set of papers in 1970. He took me under his wing, got me into a bunch of doctoral seminars with Ed Schein, who sadly just recently passed away, and he became one of my mentors, and Dave McClelland, who became my thesis advisor. And what all of them did was they convinced me I should go to graduate school, I should go in psychology, not management, because they felt like that was my forte, and I should go right for a doctorate, which I did. So as I went through the program at Harvard, and I was really focused on this issue of how do we help people change? This theory I continue to work on, and I have over these now 56 years. And in fact, right now I'm in the process of writing my big book on this, what I'm either humbly or not so humbly calling my magnum opus, but it's my last big statement, I think, on all the research we've done over all these decades. And basically what it says is, if we want to understand how people change and learn, we have to first embrace complexity theory, because the process is never linear and it's almost never continuous. The second thing is, when you study change, as I did with alcoholics and drug addicts in the 70s and later with executives, and since 87 with graduate students of all ages at Weatherhead, excuse me, it becomes very clear that there are always 5 moments of emergence where something pops into consciousness for people who actually sustainably change. One of those is the red oval, the ideal self. This is where you get a glimpse of what you would love to experience, who you'd love to be, what kind of a life you would love to have. This is not goals. This is not forecasts. This is dreams. This is a personal vision. If you have that, there's about a 5%. If you don't have that, there's about a 5% chance you'll move ahead. But if you have that, there's a very high likelihood you move ahead. And the second big discovery is how you're coming across to others. in the immediate, it's not what you think of yourself, because that's delusional, but how you come across others and the comparison to the ideal leads to a personal balance sheet. The third discovery is what kind of an agenda would be joyful at you moving ahead. Very different than performance improvement plans. The fourth discovery is the experimentation and practice. And the fifth is the center of all this, which is what this exercise was about. What are the caring, resonant relationships that make it happen? Now, I believe what you experienced in the exercise is what our research over the past, specifically on this, over the past 30 years has been showing, is that inside of each one of us, we have two strange attractors. If you follow complexity, these are Lorenz attractors that pull us around them, not into them. That's a limit point cycle. The positive emotional attractor is being in the parasympathetic nervous system arousal and having what Professor Tony Jackett case calls the empathic network, neural network activated, which is technically called the default mode network, and thinking positive thoughts. The other attractor we have inside of ourselves is the stress response, the sympathetic nervous system arousal, and activating the analytic neural network, which technically is the task positive, and the mild versions of negative thinking. I don't believe anyone resists change or learning. I believe they are pulled to different attractors. And what we don't really understand is the nature of these two attractors. The positive emotional attractor is thinking about possibilities versus what I call the NEA is problems, dreams versus expectation, optimism versus pessimism. I love this. Optimists call themselves optimists. What do pessimists call themselves? You're right, realists. This is the difference between hope and fear, thinking about strengths versus weaknesses, about thinking about trying something or novelty versus a performance improvement plan. This is resonant versus dissonant relationships. Now, the two most important conclusions that our fMRI studies, our hormonal studies, and our 39 published longitudinal studies, which some of you, by the way, are data points in from the MBA programs in the 90s and in the aughts, is that sustained desired change starts in the positive emotional attractor. That's where it starts. Because if you started in the negative emotional attractor, you psychophysiologically go into a stress response and you start to cocoon and defend yourself. And that leads to, as I'll explain in a moment, cognitive impairment. You go into trying to evaluate what's going on. You go into thinking about solving a problem. All of that creates a negative vibe, which causes you to basically, your organism goes into a defensive mode. And it's happening, by the way, at thousandths of a millisecond. Thousandths of a second, milliseconds. One of the dilemmas we have is that we know people get very little, 2% out of most above average MBA programs, advancement on the emotional and social intelligence competencies that predict effectiveness in management or professions. Treatment adherence. In most maladies, it's about 50%. Type 2 diabetics, 50%. As a result of orthopedic surgery, a broken ankle or knee replacement, 50%. My cardiothoracic surgeon students and friends of mine say for coronary bypass surgery, it's about 20%. Why? It's because physicians and nurses try to scare the crap out of you. So let's say you get diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic. Most of them will say, well, you have to exercise more, you have to lose weight, and you have to eat certain foods and eat a certain way. People just don't do that. They may do some of it. Why? Because when it's explained to you, most of the time they say, well, if you don't do it at some point, you'll become insulin resistant, and then we have to give you sugar suppressants like metformin, and then if that gets worse, you have to start injecting. It used to be insulin. Now we have these other semaglutides. And if you still don't fix it and that doesn't work, then you get neuropathy and we have to amputate your feet, and then we just keep amputating up your legs. And you say, wow, isn't that motivating? Constructive feedback, constructive criticism is still criticism. So most people who think they're trying to be helpful do what Melvin Smith and I started calling coaching for compliance, which is coaching others or trying to help them to the negative emotional attractor. And what we're saying is it does not lead to sustained desired change. What we've been calling since 2003, coaching with compassion, coaching to the other person, the positive emotional attractor, does. And that's what we've been showing and validating in all these different studies. So, first major learning point, the initiation of sustained desired change starts in the positive emotional attractor. That's what I thought most of you experienced in remembering some of these key moments. Second key proposition, I call these thrive and survive. And we have to survive. We have to go into the sympathetic nervous system. You wouldn't have been able to wake up today. You wouldn't be able to decide what you want for dinner unless we could do this. And sometimes we have to make a decision or analyze a problem, solve a problem. So we need the NEA. And that's why I call it surviving. But if all you do in life is survive, it is a drudge work. Now, the PEA, which I call thriving, is when you actually activate all these renewing processes in the body, from cellular to neuroplasticity to emotional and behavioral. But the problem is, if all you did was stay in the thriving mode, you'd probably levitate and you wouldn't get anything done. So not only do we need both of these states, but your body, your autonomic nervous system will default to the negative emotional attractor because its job is to defend the organism. So what we have learned is you have to oversample in your day-to-day experiences PEA moments to NEA moments. Barb Fredrickson said it really has to be 3-to-1 in effective teams. John Gottman said in loving, stable marriages, it's 5-to-1. Think about that. Every time you give your spouse or partner the look, you hug them 5 times. Most of us don't. We show, as I'll mention briefly later in the talk, that with coaching or helping, it's 2 or 3 times PEA moments to each NEA moment. Now, why does this happen? Well, first of all, we are hardwired to pick up emotions from the people around us. This isn't the stuff of Star Trek or Deanna Troi as the Betazoid empath. This is the stuff of human brains. And we pick up these emotions, like I said, Joseph Ledoux showed it first, in thousandths of a second, way unconscious, way below consciousness, and way below what you think you're showing or managing as your expression. It's what you're really feeling, positively or negatively. This is why I think mindfulness and emotional intelligence and awareness have become so popular these days, because people are starting to sense this is really going on. Very, very powerful. In other words, you're infecting people around you all the time with how you're really feeling inside. And when you're in an influence position, like in a helper role, a manager, a teacher, a physician, nurse, coach, therapist, parent, you are more infectious because people look to you for more cues. So what is it that ends up being so damaging? Well, if you're feeling stress, you're infecting everybody around you with it. I'm not going to go through all the psychophysiology. You could read it in our articles or in the last book. You can learn about it on the MOOC videos. But basically, within, excuse me, parts of a second from a perceived threat, you're secreting endocrines, which are both neurotransmitters and hormones. Epinephrine, norepinephrine constrains your blood vessels, so you get blood to your large muscles to fight or flight, but it's doing it in your brain as well. It's limiting which networks you have access to. And you have a series of corticosteroids resulting in cortisol entering your bloodstream, which you need. It's your body's natural anti-inflammatory. But cortisol shuts off your immune system within minutes. And this happens even from an annoying episode like your cell phone drops a call. It doesn't have to be acute stress. And cortisol stops neurogenesis, which is the conversion in the adult human of stem cells from your hippocampus and your olfactory lobe to new neurons. And if we didn't have neurogenesis going on, I mean, you're going to lose 85,000 neurons today. If you weren't experiencing neurogenesis, in no time at all, your brain starts to have this spongiform quality we see in autopsied brains of people with Alzheimer's or dementia. Now, I mean, don't panic and start drinking about the 85,000 because you started with a few billion, but nonetheless, we need it. So all of this conspires to the fact that you just don't feel on top of your game. When somebody comes up to you and says, where's the report that's due Friday? If you don't say it, your reaction is, what's it to you? Which is a defensive response outside of New York City. So we start to perceive threats even when they aren't there. This is the danger of social media. Deidre, this is another thing that is contaminating anybody under 40 now in terms of the use of electronic communication, all these social media, that there's clear evidence saying the more use, even emails, but texting and all the rest of this stuff, nevertheless, WhatsApp and Facebook and Instagram and all this, the more people use it, the more depressed they are. And it's even being linked to higher incidence of suicide. Why? Because of this. Because nobody goes to social media for an enlightening moment. They go in a defensive mode. So this ends up being, if you're feeling stressed, you're spreading it to everybody else around you. Now, if all that's going on and it's compromised your immune system, given the age profile of many of you on the call today, how come you're not dead? Well, there are two possibilities. One, you are. And isn't this what you thought heaven would be? Sorry if any of you are offended by the blaspheming, but no, but the real reason is our bodies have the parasympathetic nervous system built in, which does the exact opposite. You watch a baby laughing or watch a golden retriever puppy rolling over in the grass, and you start to get what's called the Duchenne, the accurate of the 18 smiles, the accurate smile, which starts to secrete a different set of endocrines. Oxytocin primarily in women, vasopressin in men. And at these dosage levels, these do the opposite to what the three endocrines that are released in the sympathetic nervous system do into your body. So they open up your capillaries so you feel warmer. Your pulse rate slows down, your breathing gets deeper. Your immune system clicks in. It won't make up for an immune deficiency disorder, but it will help your immune system operate at its best level that it can. This is where neurogenesis occurs. This is where you are cognitively at your best. You're the most creative, you can handle the most complex concepts, and you're the most open to scanning the environment, including the human environment. All of this has been shown in multiple studies published in both psychological and medical journals. We even know a study was done using nose sprays of epinephrine versus oxytocin, and your peripheral vision, which unless you're a pilot, you wouldn't know this, but your peripheral vision is, if you take your hands and open them up and do about one hand length from your shoulders, hold them in front of you, stare at a point right in front of you on the wall or on your computer, and just keep moving your hands outward until you lose track of them. That's your peripheral vision. Mine's just under 180 degrees right now. Okay, so in this one published study, they showed that if they sprayed epinephrine, stimulated sympathetic nervous system, it went down to 30 degrees. They sprayed oxytocin in the other nose, went back out to 180. So we are cognitively, emotionally, and perceptually impaired under even chronic mild stress, annoying stress. You add to it the acute stressors of a pandemic, of the financial job insecurities created, of all of the social and political disruptions going on in our cities, and with all of the ways we have gravitated towards not being able to have a conversation with somebody who disagrees with us. We have to call them names now, and we hate them because they're different than we are. So all of this notion that we can only tolerate people who are just like us ends up permeating our environment and creates just a lot of stress. So the biggest challenge we have is, how do we do renewal? Well, I don't put something on here until it's shown up in at least 5 published papers. We know that meditation helps in terms of mindfulness, and even 3 times a week helps. We know that yoga helps. We know that Tai Chi helps. We know that prayer helps if it's to a loving God. We know that modest exercise helps. We know that feeling hopeful about the future helps. That's why you shouldn't watch the news on TV. We know that being in a loving relationship helps. We know that caring for people in the community who are less fortunate helps. We know that caring for the elderly helps. I say to my current graduate students, caring for your elderly professors will get you closer to heaven. Having a dog, cat, or in some parts of the country or world, horse or a monkey, it has to be an animal you pet, you stroke, that stimulates parasympathetic in them. You get it back through the contagion. That helps. We know that laughter, joy, and playfulness helps. We know that playing music, not listening to music, but actually playing it or dancing helps. And just listening to music doesn't always. And a walk in nature does. So those are a variety of things. We've been talking about some of these things for years. Dan Goleman and I did a series of studies. The last one that got published with Uday Andar, who's now at Professor Bucknell, and John Kalu-Osiri, who's at professor at Nebraska, in which we showed that the number of moments you have in a typical week, like last week, that are renewing, minus the number of moments you had that are annoying stress episodes, predicts higher engagement, sense of well-being, career satisfaction, more empathy felt, more empathy demonstrated, less depression, more resilience, et cetera, et cetera. And in the discovery of this, in these series of studies that was just published a little over a year ago, we showed in this instrument we use for research, and now sometimes in the training programs, the Personal Sustainability Index, we show that what's more important any given day is having more frequent, smaller doses of these, 10 to 15-minute doses. We also show that the variety of things you did during a typical week was as powerful as the number of episodes. That's the challenge. So how do you first manage your renewal so that when you're infecting your clients, students, patients, subordinates, or children, you're doing it with renewal? The analytic versus empathic mode, or the task positive versus default mode. This is a graph from Tony Jack's landmark study in 1913, showing that these two neural networks are antagonistic. So every time you think about finance or something abstract, you suppress your ability to be open to new ideas or other people, and vice versa. It's why poor MBA students usually graduate with statistically significantly less social intelligence than they had when they entered, because we subject them to accounting, statistics, finance, economics. And then somebody says, ooh, let's study Harvard Business School cases analytically. So the poor things, no wonder. And very often we go into problem-solving mode, which is analytic, thinking it will help. And it may, and it's useful at times, but it chases out your openness to new ideas. So Melvin and I started calling this Coaching with Compassion, and then Ellen joined us in the effort, and we now teach this regularly in the MBA and the MPOD program, and to some extent in the MBA courses, and certainly in the DBA, the Executive Doctorate. And we have certificate programs at Weatherhead that many of you know of. But the key is, if you want to help people, you coach with compassion. And here we're using the Confucian interpretation. So you don't anchor your coaching or helping in problem solving. You don't anchor it in their presenting problem, because all of that forces you into the NEA and starts to close down the openness to change. You anchor your work in their big picture. What's their vision? What's their dream of life? Or in the quality of your caring relationship. So we've got 39 published longitudinal studies showing at Weatherhead, we've got 30 to 60 times the impact on emotional and social intelligence behavior than above average MBA programs have, about 2%, and the best training programs in industry and government, about 11%. But we're showing it holds out, everything decreases over time, to about a 15% improvement in these behaviors 5 to 7 years later. So we put it to a test. This paper came out a number of years ago, and we showed that 30 minutes of coaching someone to their dreams versus coaching to what problems they're having. They go into an fMRI 3 to 5 days later. The two coaches, Randall Passarelli, who's tenured senior faculty at College of Charleston, Masood Khawaja, who's faculty at the medical school at the University of British Columbia. They were the coaches randomly assigned to whether they were PEA or NEA, randomly assigned who went first. And what we showed is that the PEA activated the lateral visual cortex, where you dream, but very powerfully, the PEA activated parts of the default mode, the posterior cingulate cortex, the nucleus accumbens, and orbitofrontal cortex, and the NEA activated more analytic parts. Well, we won an award at the Academy of Management and won accolades of Society of Neuroscience. So we did a replication study a few years later, which hopefully we're about to get published finally, with 50 people rather than 20, half males, half females. But here we tested how much of the PEA do you need? And what we were able to show is that when we replicated the earlier findings, but we also showed that if you had 2 or 3 PEA 30-minute conversations compared to 1 NEA, you activated this yellow area here called the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. And Naomi Eisenberger and now a whole bunch of others have shown is the key in the default mode network, in the empathic network, and it's the crosswalk to your activating the parasympathetic nervous system. By the way, it has now been shown in several meta-analyses that this is the area of the brain that is suffering the most deterioration of white matter and density of gray matter in long COVID. The good news is we believe because of neuroplasticity, you can build it up again. But what was fascinating, you can see on this chart, was 2 or 3 PEAs really had the dramatic effect. Just writing your vision didn't. So when you're trying to help somebody, your leverage is either their vision and dreams, not goals, big picture, and 10 years out, or the quality of your relationship or strengths. Masood Khawaja studied type 2 diabetics and found all these things on the left that medical research say affect treatment adherence did, but they were all mediated by the patient's perception of whether or not their physician had the same vision for their future as they did. Again, not goals, vision. The key ends up being this ideal self, and the enemy is the ought self. And yet how often we go into trying to help people and we don't engage it. So if you think back to the opening exercise, now, what does this have to do with mental health? Clearly, mental health is one result of people being drawn into the ravages of chronic stress and just sinking deeper and deeper into the NEA. And not knowing, not feeling that there's a way out of it. I believe the rampant narcissism in our society today. I mean, when did the selfie become the most popular form of photography? And then along with the narcissism, we have this unbelievably rigid self-justification that, of course, my positions are correct, are valued, are truth, justice, and beauty. And these other people are, to quote one person who was in a leadership role, are deplorable. And we immediately knee jerk and call them significant names, regardless of what they're doing, if they disagree with us. So why are we so scared that we can't talk to people who have different ideas? Because we're scared. The antidote, as I'm offering you today from all of our research, are moments of renewal. And while each of us can do it, a lot of them are happening in interactions with others. And that's where these moments of caring come in. So what I've offered you today is 18 specific things you can continue doing or reinforce doing or start doing. It usually takes practice. We now have an app that was launched last week that for those of you who would like to have daily reminders and thoughts on your cell phone or your iPad, it's out, and you can go to it. If you follow either Melvin or Ellen or myself, we've all posted about it on LinkedIn. I don't know if we did Facebook, but certainly LinkedIn recently. And I'm just going to skip the stuff about the competency study for now and just say, we have a very special gift from our God, life. Let's not waste it. And if we talk to the 7.5 billion people alive on Earth who can't move closer to their dreams the way we can, they would say, don't waste your opportunity. So my appeal to you is to remember these moments with other people that cared about you. Remember these moments of laughter and playfulness. Because when you do, you well up with this positive state and you become positively infectious. And you start to find in your families, in your communities, and at work, people coming together and doing things you never thought before were possible. So thank you very much. I'm going to stop the screen sharing and I'm going to open it up to questions. So just unmute and ask your question, please, or thought or observation.
Hi, Richard. It's Diana Rivenberg. How are you?
Hi, Diana. Good to see you again.
Good to see you. Thank you very much. Appreciate this. You had something in there about writing your vision doesn't have as much of a positive impact. Was there another piece of that I missed? Was it actually visualizing the vision?
No, it was talking to someone else about it.
Oh, okay.
So writing helped, but it didn't help much. And I think writing helps by getting you to reflect and, and get stuff up from the unconscious, because we have so much ought self around us that blocks us in. It's hard for us to break free from that. But what our fMRI studies have shown, all three of them, is that in the Angie's hormonal study and Anita Howard's hormonal study around coaching, is that it's the talking with someone about the PEA in that mode. So people who, well, because you went through the MPOD, but when you're trained in how to do this coaching to the more positive, doesn't mean you eliminate the negative. It's there in life, and you sometimes coach people about it. But it's the talking about it with someone that really makes it activate the right things in your brain and your body.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you, Diana. Someone else. Okay, somebody just wrote in the chat, the big picture versus goals. Goals are specific. You've all been beat to death with SMART goals. I just wrote the chapter of my new book on this, and we have plenty of evidence now to show that when you talk about specific goals, you activate a neural network called an instrumental. It's the frontoparietal control network that activates both the analytic and the default mode. And very often you go into what in industrial organizational psychology has been called a proving mode to show that you can reach the goal, which means you're in a defensive mode. So when you set specific goals, you actually close the person down to learning. Now, specific goals are helpful in the change process later, but not at the beginning. You don't want to close people down at the beginning. You want to open them up. So what our research says is you ask somebody not about their goals, which are specific and put you in this NEA mode, but you ask them about their dreams. What kind of person would you love to be? I mean, the biggest question we train our folks in is to ask the question, if your life were absolutely fantastic 10 to 15 years from now, what would it be like? 10 to 15 years. We don't want you forecasting. Okay, so I hope whoever asked that question, sorry, I couldn't see, I hope that clarifies the difference. Goals are useful, but it's down the path once you've eliminated all the possibilities. Because if you close down too soon, you're going to eliminate seeing everything else around you.
Can I ask a question as well?
Sure.
My experience, and is limited, but I sense that some people struggle really to identify their ideal self with some level of very compelling and unique vision. And they might have multiple vision or etc. And so the question is, to what extent you need to close that multiple options versus one as a coach? What is right, what is wrong in that sense?
Grazie, Massimo. So first, there are times in which people have trouble coming to grips with a dream. Why? We talk about this in chapter 9 of Helping People Change, the book. One problem is people have been really abused. You know, they have perfectionist parents, or they've grown up in totalitarian regimes. And yeah, from my point of view, having lived in totalitarian regimes, both fascist and communist, for short periods of time, believe me, those words are bandied about in the United States without meaning at all compared to what really happens in them. But, you know, when sharing a thought you have with a family member could lead you to being sent to the gulag, which is virtually a death sentence, that I have experienced this with folks that come out of those regimes. They have a hard time doing anything other than putting their foot in front of the other foot. That would also apply to trauma. So people who have been the victims of violence or other forms of trauma are very often beaten from thinking about dreaming. We have people that aren't beaten that extremely, but fear, because of whatever it is that's caused it, fear the idea of saying what they would wish for because it would jinx it, as if somehow there's a God that's keeping tally of what you say in retribution. So there are a number of things like that that could negatively do it. If that's the case, my feeling is you help the person by introducing them into the PEA in smaller doses. Sometimes do deep breathing with them. Sometimes I very often will say to folks that are in training, use the lottery question. So you do a more playful version. You just won $80 million after tax in the lottery. How has your work or life changed? You know, somebody says, well, I pay off my mortgage and I do a fund for my kids. You know, that's ridiculous. You invest $80 million in a diversified portfolio and it's kicking off $4.5 to $5 million a year. You know, you do all that stuff in the first 2 months. So the question is, you know, how do you help somebody be more playful? Sometimes you have to step them into it with smaller doses. The second part is what happens if you were asking if a person has multiple dreams or their dream kind of goes in some different ways. Very often that is in terms of how to use their capability, their assets, if you will, how to work. I don't know too often that people, you know, have multiple partners and they're trying to figure out which they really love more. I mean, although it does happen. But in terms of that, I would suggest that what you do is you just help people play out each of these images. What was it like? Because very often in the playing out, making it more visual, where would you be living? If you're living with anybody else, with whom? What's your relationships like? And we go after a holistic vision. We want to know your physical health, your spiritual health, your romantic health, your contributions to the community, all of that before we get to jobs and career. Because work exists within life, not the other way around. So very often, if you get people to be clearer about their visualization, one of those things shows a lot more nonverbal excitement. So they have a rank order. More often than not, if somebody says to me, well, I have different things that I'd love to do, chances are a few of them aren't really theirs. They're holdovers from their parents or their teachers, or they're what I call ought selves. So breaking free from the ought selves ends up being a big move. With folks, I mean, most psychologists say latency is 26, that a person doesn't actually become an adult till they're 26. We know that most people don't even have the neurological networks capable of fully thinking about other people till they're somewhere in their late teens. And it's one of the reasons why I have trouble with making access to marijuana and cannabis so easy for teenagers. I think it's hitting them at a time in which they're not neurologically prepared. But very often people, and if people grow up in societies that are very hierarchical, so if you grew up in Indian society or Chinese or Japanese or Middle Eastern, you're taught to respect authority in contrast to the United States or more egalitarian societies even than us, where you're taught to be suspicious of authority. But when you're taught to respect authority, what comes with that is collectivism. And what comes with collectivism is an obligation to do what you're told to do. Collectivism is beautiful, but, just like individualism is beautiful, but collectivism also has required conformity at a very extreme level, and ostracism if you violate the conformity. Part of that is you're supposed to live out. I mean, some of the people we get in the 40s in our executive doctorate program or the EMBA or the MPOD. I mean, I joke about that, welcome to your midlife crisis, because for some of them, that's the first time they're starting to wrestle with what do they want out of life versus other people. Sorry, that was a long-winded answer, Massimo, but it's got a lot of parts to it. Does that help? Okay, there you go. And another question. I can still keep going for a little bit. So if people have some other questions or comments, I'll be glad to field them.
When you're working with multinational culture or groups, if you're coaching a team, how do you proactively manage for the differences? Like, for example,
right.
higher levels of conformity or respect for authority and so on.
Yeah. The first thing, Monica, is I think you have to pay attention to the atmosphere you've created in the team or the group, so that it encourages people to participate. And that's awkward because depending upon gender, culture interactions, Japanese females will contribute less if there's a male in the room than because of their culture and what has been they've been socialized into. So there are gender and ethnic interactions, but to the extent possible, doing some things that enable people to contribute. That's why if you're doing teamwork, as you know, you want to make sure you have interactive exercises within the first 5 to 10 minutes. Because if you don't start that way, people fall into a norm. The reason you want that first is diversity is key. I mean, without diversity, we don't have adaptation or innovation. But the problem that we have is most of the time, we don't utilize the diversity of perspective or thought. What we do is we close it down. I mean, the biggest problem with the lack of efficacy, as the research has shown, of most diversity programs in the past 30 years, is they've closed people down instead of opening them up. The hope was that as inclusiveness became more part of it, people would start to use different techniques, not the old process of name calling. That goes the same way when talking about dreams. So to be able to talk about in a team, what's our purpose? Why are we here? You know, and what I'll say to people, if they'll say, you know, when I first meet them in a coaching session, I'll say, well, you know, what's on your mind? And they'll give me their presenting problem. I will say, okay, that's important. That's serious. We'll get to that. Before we start talking about that, though, help me get a sense of your big picture. I want to know kind of not just who you are, but what's going on. You know, what are you in life about? I would use the same line in a team and try to get them. I'd pay attention to the nonverbals. I would encourage every person to say something, you know, techniques like that, I know because you've used these often, but that's the key. If you can establish that, if you can establish some listening to each other and then pull on the diversity of thought, of perspectives, excuse me, you've got a good chance of people starting to talk about how they look at these things differently. And as far as I can tell, that's the only way to help us come together. It takes time. Yes. It's sloppy. It's not neat. And you can't put it on a very quick timetable.
So
Any other?
Richard, if it's okay with you, Richard, we have people out of respect for their time. We can close the session formally, but you can stay on as long as you have time and continue taking questions.
Oh, sure.
But
I'll be glad to stay on another 5 or 10 minutes. But yes, for anybody who needs to go, thank you. God bless. Have a good weekend.
Richard, I have to go as well, but I just wanted to say it was good to see you again.
Hey, James, yeah, it's great to see you. You still in Alaska?
I am.
So are you dodging
And-
Chinese balloons?
Well, oddly enough, yes.
Oh, sorry. The current administration says they might not be Chinese balloons. They may be UFOs, right?
No, the other morning when they shot one down over Prudhoe Bay,
Yeah.
I didn't hear my wife that there was a lot of jet noise over our house because we're not far from the base where the missions were launched from.
Yeah, right. Ugh.
And it just got daylight, so I can move on.
Right. Good. Yeah,
Thanks,
that's right.
Richard.
This time of the year, you don't have a lot of daylight.
6 minutes more every day.
Any other thoughts or observations or questions?
Richard, I've got a question.
Yeah.
And so now I'm in healthcare, and I've been placed in charge of a new leader onboarding program. And one of the things that I've recognized is that a lot of managers who become leaders because of their subject matter expertise, they're promoted within the organization.
Right.
And go to discover that there are a lot of leadership aptitudes that are not as strong as we would think that a leader would have. And out of all of these elements, I always like to say that soft skills are rock hard, and that in the sense of the strength that they bring to the situation. With all of these elements, I've got a lot of resources and tools that I can hit new leaders with. That's almost like drinking from a fire hose. However, what would you say would be some of the most important or the most potent skills to introduce to new leaders that can really help them be game changers within their departments?
Earl, we've got a study. We closed the data collection and we've begun the data analysis right now. I'm on one of the boards at MD Anderson, which, by the way, I think if you want a model of an organization that creates a culture of development to complement the culture of performance, MD Anderson is it. I don't know of any other organization that has done as good a job at all levels. But at any rate, Peter Pisters, the CEO, a noted oncologist himself, came in knowing that emotional intelligence was key. But there is no published study linking emotional intelligence, behavior, and physician outcomes. So we're actually doing that study right now. I hope that data will help some people who are on the fence. But mostly the issue is in all professional services, healthcare, universities, consulting companies, law firms, it's all the same. We get promoted every year because we're specialists. We know more and more about less and less, and it's task oriented. It's actually the opposite of what you want to do very often. So the idea is how to help people reset. Now, the benefit in healthcare is you're dealing with folks that on the whole are really smart cognitively. So if you can get their attention, they'll go, hey, yeah, that's right. So part of it ends up, I guess I do a lot of work with hospitals, MGH and the Cleveland Clinic and many others. I very often use those simple exercises we used in class, which is, tell me about an experience you had with a leader who brought out the best in you. Tell me about an experience you had with a leader who did not. And I just get people to talk about that. I get them to do it early in any interaction because that's an emotional realization. And you win them over emotionally before you do it analytically.
Mhm.
So I would say two things as your strategy, Earl. Get them to talk about their own experiences and which were the most exciting. And then also introduce some of these PEA techniques like vision and purpose. Tom Strauss, who was a very resonant leader and built Stuma Health Systems, in Central Ohio and now Pennsylvania, amazingly so. I mean, he used to have heads of the hospitals tell a story. He used to give up 10 minutes of his 60-minute management meeting every week to 2 stories that he'd tell them to bring in of patients who were helped at their facility. Because it reminded everybody at the beginning of the meeting that you're there to heal, not to just make budget. I mean, making budget's important, but that's not the purpose. So I'd say those 2 things, use emotional engaging exercises and work the purpose, the vision.
Okay. Is there anything that can help with contributing to the global body of knowledge specifically, since there seems to be a deficit of studies in this area?
Well, think about, how you can engage and do some research, and then call one of us or, a faculty member who thinks about research all the time, because, as you know from, the master's program and reading about this stuff, rigorous research is not always the practical aspect that people see when you're actually doing it. So, but yeah, I mean, we need this kind of research all the time.
Thank you.
I
So, yes.
really appreciate your comment about the exemplar with MD Anderson. I'm curious about how they pull it off. I know one of the questions I had was, how do you weave more PEA inducing things into your process of, like, whether it's performance management, how, like, systemically, how do you create an organism that is more PEA inducing?
Right.
I think it's so important. I don't have a way of codifying what's going on, but things just feel different. People feel a level of saturation, and I just have concern that organization performance is now going to be at the expense of human beings.
Where do you
been.
work, Laura?
I work at Penske at a transportation.
Right. Yeah. Sorry. I should have remembered that. I apologize.
No, that's fine.
Okay, so
different.
As you've heard me say, I think for organizations, the real holy grail is to develop a culture of development that complements the culture of performance. They can't be together. They can't be the same thing, because we now know that neurologically, these 2 things are antagonistic. So every time you focus on performance, you're going into the NEA. It's fine. It's necessary. But we also know engagement was at crisis levels before COVID. Now, I guess I heard on NPR yesterday, beyond quiet quitting and the Great Resignation, there's another that it's actually an old expression, but retiring in grade. And so we've got massive motivation crises going on. And because of the ambient level of fear that we're continuing to perpetuate. You know, and God help us if we can find any leaders. I mean, we haven't had a leader who appealed to PEA for multiple groups in even in the United States society, in maybe 40 years, 45 years. So, you know, everybody has certain people they were favorites of, but it doesn't mean there weren't other people who were vilified by those individuals. And this is happening now in our political landscape. I'm sorry to say, I think it's happening in our organizational landscape too, because an awful lot of organizational leaders are running scared from those other people that are doing all the name calling. And again, it's coming from all sectors. So I'm not taking any positions on this stuff. It's just horrible. What it means, though, is that there's a level. I mean, I remember Jimmy Carter saying there was a level of malaise after 10 years of trying to fight the war in Vietnam and hyperinflation. Now it's not malaise, it's depression. So what's the antidote? You step in development and you don't try to replace performance. You know what? You wouldn't exist. What you're trying to do is build a culture of development that parallels performance, knowing that you don't do it at the same time. So don't try to have the development conversation with a performance review. They're incompatible. Teach coaching processes to everyone. Have development. I mean, MD Anderson has courses, interaction groups, peer coaching groups, and online resources for everybody who works in the organization, from staff, aides, secretaries, all the way up to the heads of medicine and the heads of divisions. And it's not just one program, it's multiple things with multiple modes. And there's always the encouragement for a person to keep pursuing it. It's offered in ways that people could do it, some while they're at work and some outside of work. But it is the thoroughness and the comprehensiveness, the true inclusiveness that I think is masterful in the way they've gone about it. And it's not just that they're offering the programs. I've seen the results over the past number of years being on one of the boards of how, I mean, they're right now dealing with engagement scores of 89%, and they want to get it up to 91. In most organizations in North America, it's 80% people are disengaged.
Well, that also gets to, well, how are we measuring engagement too? What are those constructs? Are there ways, if you're doing an engagement survey, that you could be,
Sure.
like, are there different things to be looking for?
Yeah, the easiest measure is, are you excited about your work? You know, and do you find it meaningful? Look, the Great Resignation, in most cases, wasn't people chasing higher pay. In most cases, it was people realizing their current job sucked or their manager did. So they just wanted to get out.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm now hitting a point where I've got to quickly do something before my 2 o'clock. My email is on the first slide. Quite a few of you, as former, if not current students, have my email anyway. If you want to follow up with sending me an email, please go ahead and do it. Of the resources available, the Helping People Change book integrates a lot of that. We have 2 MOOCs that are available with 10-minute videos, and then now this new app. But of course, if you haven't already been in the MPOD program and you really want to learn about this kind of stuff at the skill level, come and join us for an MPOD experience. It will change your life. So thank you very much, Pat and group.
Thank you very much, Richard. And thanks to all of you for attending. I hope we'll see you next month. I posted the link to register for Reinventing Resilience, how organizations can thrive through continuous change with one of our own MPOD alums and authors, Paul Talner. So until then, I hope to see you, and thank you again, Richard, for another inspiring webinar.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.